Okay, so I'm supposed to take roll today. My boss wants me to because she wants to send out interventions to anyone who's not attending so that we can try to get that 35% of people who don't pass the first time. We want to try to improve that. So will one of you guys remember to ask me to take roll at the end? Okay. I won't do it the rest of the semester. She's just saying if you flunked something the first week and or you have missed classes, we're going to send you some information that lets you know that's a really good way to fail the class, which I'm pretty sure they know. Don't you think they know that? Probably. But I'm going to have to send it anyway. Okay, so we are going to finish epithelial tissues. The last thing that we have to do is to just talk about how epithelial cells stay attached to one another, because of course we know that one of the characteristics of epithelial tissue is that the cells are right next to one another, right? Okay, so let's go back to the metaphor that we were using before about tiling a floor. So if you are tiling a floor, and we say, okay, the superficial surface of the subfloor is actually like the top of the connective tissue, right? And then we know that you put down adhesive, the basement membrane, right? Put down adhesive, and then you put the cells right next to one another, like tile, right? But then we haven't addressed the grout yet. What is it that keeps the cells next to one another? So these are called lateral cell junctions or lateral cell adhesions. Does lateral make sense to you? This is how the cells are stuck to one another laterally. All right, so there's 3 different types of grout. There's a lot of different types of grout. Of course, you can have waterproof, you can have flexible, you can have outdoor, you can have whatever. In cells, there's 3 different types of grout. So the types of grout have to do with what the cell actually needs. So let's talk about one of them. One of the types of grout right here is called a desmosome. I want you to imagine that that is a spot weld between the 2 cells. So these 2 are right next to each other. They are going to be 2 cells in an epithelial tissue. And desmosomes are specifically about strength. So what I want to accomplish with a desmosome is if I pulled on them this way, they wouldn't pop apart. And here's how you do that. A desmosome will reach the proteins from her cytoskeleton in and grab onto the proteins from her cytoskeleton and the opposite way. Yeah? So they're really strong. But it's a spot weld, so it's not impermeable. If we were playing Red Rover, I could go under it or over it, but I just couldn't pull it apart this way. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's what a desmosome is about. The word that should go in your head for desmosome is strength. Okay. But there's some other needs that you might have. Now, what I want is impermeability. And by impermeability, I mean that I am some kind of toxic solute. This is the epithelial tissue. You guys are the connective tissue behind it. What I want them to be able to prevent me from getting through, right? And so a spot weld wouldn't do it because I could Red Rover it, right? But what could happen is I could use a waterproof scuba zipper that zipped them both to each other, but not just in one place. You'd have to do it throughout the entire dimension of the cell. That is called a tight junction, and you are seeing a tight junction right here, guys. Do you see this? How you've got them zipped together? Yeah? Tight junctions are about impermeability. So specifically, it keeps me from being able to go between the cells. So let's talk about a couple of instances in which that would be useful. Either I don't want something going that way, or I don't want something going that way. So now I want you to imagine that this is the epithelial tissue lining the stomach. The solution inside the stomach has a pH of about 2. It's super acidic. You dropped it on your skin, didn't wash it off, it would irritate it and cause a lesion, okay? So the cells that are lining the stomach, the epithelial cells, are modified so they can handle that pH. But do you think you guys are? No. So what I have to do is I have to zip them together so that that particular solute cannot get through. Does that make sense? So you use tight junctions. You also use tight junctions in your skin to keep from losing water. Yeah? And sometimes tight junctions are not about making it impermeable, but controlling the permeability. So for instance, now I want you guys to be the epithelial tissue lining the small intestine, and I want to absorb glucose. And glucose could go through between the cells, theoretically, but then I would lose control of it or lose track of it, and glucose is like money, right? So what do I really want to do? I want to go through her, right? Zip them together so they can't go between. and then go through, and then she will specifically put me where she wants me to go, right? So controlling the permeability or making it impermeable. Is that good? So that's what tight junctions are for. And then the last one is gap junctions. And gap junctions are these guys over here. Gap junctions aren't about strength and aren't about impermeability. What they are about is communication. So what will happen with gap junctions is she has a channel on her cell membrane and she has a channel on her cell membrane, and they stick them together so that whatever message she gets, she'll get it right after, right? And it can make them coordinate as a group, right? And so, for instance, if you were going to say, I want you to do the wave, and she would do it, then she would do it, and if you had them all connected via gap junctions, they would all respond in sequence, right? Does that make sense? But they're not strong, okay? So, gap junctions are communication. Desmosomes are what? And tight junctions are impermeability, exactly. So, what if you had a tissue that needed both strength and impermeability? What would you do? You'd use both, right? You'd use desmosomes and gap junctions. Cardiac muscle needs both strength because it's filling and emptying, filling and emptying. And, oh, sorry, that's strength and communication. Strength and communication in cardiac muscle has gap junctions and desmosomes because it needs strength, but it also needs the cells to act as a single unit, right? And if you needed both strength and impermeability, like the skin, you don't want to lose water, but you also want to be strong, resistant to stretching and twisting in a bunch of directions, you would use desmosomes and tight junctions. Exactly. Does that make sense? So there are a lot of situations in which you can use more than one type of junction. Cool? And it's not just for epithelial tissues, but of course they exist in epithelial tissues. Everybody all right with that? Okay, so gap junctions are used, by the way, in your respiratory tract when you want the cilia to keep the stuff from getting into your lungs. We don't want them waving like this, right? We want them waving like that. And how do you do that? Well, you start the stimulus from down here, and then they respond in order so that they're coordinated wave-like motion up. Does that make sense? Okay, so now the last thing I'm going to do with you guys is give you some practice with how do you know when you are finished studying epithelial tissues, right? So here's what most people do. They look at any image and they go, okay, what is this tissue? What is it? Stratified cuboidal epithelium. Great. That's as far as most people ever go. That is not all the questions you can ask out of that, okay? You can ask about any specialized structure. Of course, you can ask the simple question, which is, what general category of tissue is this? Which is an epithelium, right? And then you can ask the name of the tissue. But you also have to be able to name any modified structure, like what is this? That is the lumen. What is this? Goblet cell, exactly. So any modified structure is fair game. You also have to be able to name the surfaces, right? What's the surface? What's the surface? Apical surface. What is this surface? Basal surface. What is this structure? Basement membrane. All fair game, right? Okay. Now here's where people generally fail. You have to be able to name a specific body location for every one of these epithelial tissues. And people have a very hard time with this. And in addition, it's not going to be multiple choice because I don't know which body location you memorized. It's going to be fill in the blank, right? Or you can memorize all of them and then I can make it multiple choice. Which one do you want? You want fill in the blank. But now you're going to know that if you don't know any of the body locations, you're going to leave like 8 blanks. Right? Okay, so let's do this one. Name a specific body location for this tissue. Nope. Have to identify the tissue first. Stratified columnar epithelium. Lining the male urethra. Lining the male urethra. Let's practice some more. Name a specific body location for this tissue. Lining the mouth. That's good. Lining the vagina. You got it. Name a specific body location for this tissue. Got to identify it first. What is it? What is it? It's not pseudostratified. It's ciliated simple. Lining the uterine tubes or fallopian tubes. Okay, let's do a little bit more practice. What is this tissue? Transitional. Don't leave me without a noun. Epithelium. Okay. Lining the urinary bladder. Got it? Name a location for this tissue. That's a great answer, but it's not to the question I asked. Name a body location for this tissue. Epidermis. Yeah, good? Got it? Okay, so here's where students do not do well on histology. But you do not have to be one of those students because I'm telling you these kinds of questions are coming. Okay? So you need to make sure that you're confident about naming a body location. If it only has one body location, you should be able to pick it out of a list. Or if I've talked about it, you should be able to pick it out of a list. Other than that, memorize whatever one you want, and I'll write a fill-in-the-blank question for you. Good? Okay? All right. So, and then please let's not forget that even if you're used to looking at it this way, you can name that, what's that thing? Nucleus, cytoplasm, cell membrane, right? It's the cells. They're still cells, right? So you can still do that, especially if you can see that kind of stuff. Everybody okay with that? So what I would do, if I were you, is when I look at epithelial tissues, I would look through this list and be really critical about the level of knowledge that I have, right? Can I answer all of these questions with like 16 different iterations of the same tissue? And then once I can, and I'm completely bored with it and get it right almost all the damn time, then you're done, you're good, right? Okay? Don't just study the slides that they have in the packets or on the PowerPoint in lab. Make sure that you find other sources to look at the slides as well. And of course, I try to find the best slides I can to show you, right? But they're not necessarily familiar slides to you, right? Does that make sense? Okay, all right. So last little tidbit about epithelial tissue is just that not all epithelial tissue is like covering surfaces specifically. Some of it is actually forming glands. So let's find our glandular epithelium for just a second. Okay, so glands are slightly different than the rest of the epithelium, but they still have some of the other characteristics. They still have a really rapid rate of cell division. And a gland is simply one or more cells that produce and secrete a product. Okay, that means that a goblet cell, this is a transmission electron micrograph of a goblet cell. That's a gland, isn't it? It's just a unicellular gland, produce and secrete a product. So this is what a goblet cell looks like up really close if you haven't seen those. The reason it looks like a goblet is because the nucleus is way down at the bottom and it makes the bottom look really skinny, right? And then the rest of it is kind of wider at the top. And it produces this protein called mucin, which when you mix it with water forms mucus, right? And then it dumps it onto the surface, right? So that is a unicellular gland, is what it is. But of course, not all glands are unicellular. So let's talk about the types of glands that exist. There's two big categories of glands. You have exocrine glands and endocrine glands. Where do exocrine glands secrete their products? It's kind of to the outside, but it's really to a surface, right? So you could secrete it not to the outside of the body like a sweat gland, but to the lumen of the digestive tract, and you'd still be considered exocrine. Does that make sense? So it doesn't have to go outside the body, but it goes onto the surface. So typically exocrine glands, most of them, except for the unicellular ones, will have a duct leading to a surface, yeah? Now, if you just look at this, couldn't you actually tell that that's epithelial tissue? Right? I mean, you may not be familiar with the type of epithelial tissue, but doesn't it have an apical surface and the cells are really close together? This one too, right? So for me, by the way, you don't have to identify individual types of exocrine glands, but you should be able to look at a picture and say, oh, that's an exocrine gland, it's epithelial tissue. Does that make sense? So exocrine glands secrete their products onto a surface. There's several different categories. You can look at all of these. You will not be tested on the individual categories, but you should certainly be able to look at it and tell that it's epithelial tissue, and because it's got a duct leading to the surface, it should be exocrine. Does that make sense? Okay, so we'll talk about some examples of exocrine glands. Other than a goblet cell, can you think of some glands that are exocrine? Sweat, oil, what? Sebaceous and sudoriferous, those are oil and sweat. Huh?
Tear ducts.
Tear ducts, yeah, those are lacrimal glands. Mammary glands, yeah. Salivary glands, all of the glands that dump into your digestive tract are exocrine. That makes sense? So exocrines go onto a surface, and you're going to run into them quite often. And then endocrine glands. Endocrine glands are the ones, I don't even show you a picture of the histology of an endocrine gland because it doesn't look anything like any of the other epithelial tissues. Why is it an epithelial tissue? First of all, it's derived embryonically from the same tissue as other epithelial. And as an adult, it has the same kind of characteristics, mostly like a really fast rate of cell division. But they tend to be very, very vascular, because I want you to imagine at exocrine gland just a ball of cells that are really close to one another. They are not near the surface. So like my pituitary gland, deep just under my brain, is an endocrine gland. You guys with me? So it's not going to be near the surface, so it's not going to have like an apical surface or anything like that, so it won't look the same. It's not going to have a duct because it's not going toward the surface. So how does it dump its products? Well, unlike other epithelial tissues, it's richly vascular. It's got a huge capillary bed in it, so it's going to make a product, and then the product is going to get secreted and picked up by the bloodstream. So what do you call the products of endocrine glands? Hormones. Hormones, exactly, right. So they get dumped into the bloodstream. So I want you guys to think for me for a second about some endocrine glands. Name some endocrine glands. Pituitary, thyroid, adrenal glands, good. These guys have had physiology, so they should be able to name, what, 30 endocrine glands? Because they took it backwards. You will learn so many endocrine glands. Pancreas, the ovaries are partially endocrine glands, the testes are partially endocrine glands, not completely. So there's a ton of them. So their products go into the bloodstream. Now let's one more time just reiterate the fact that because epithelial tissue, whether it's exocrine, endocrine, or surface epithelial tissue, has a really fast rate of cell division and regeneration, it is the tissue that is most predisposed to cancer, right? So how do you, for instance, decrease the likelihood that your epithelial tissue, which is already dividing quickly, is going to lose control of its cell division? Well, you don't blast it with known carcinogens and mutagens, right? So I know that some of you guys still think tanning is a good idea. It is absolutely not. You are blasting your epithelial tissue with known carcinogens, is what you are doing. You are increasing for your entire life the predisposition to cancer, not just now, okay? In addition, of course, you're also increasing for your entire life the predisposition to ugly, right? Because how many of us who are over 30 wish we could redo our tanning years? Oh, hell yeah. All this, I was the baby oil and iodine on the roof kid. No sunscreen whatsoever. So it will break down your collagen fibers too, which we'll talk about. And then, of course, with your respiratory epithelium, you do not want to breathe in and out carcinogens and then just expect to be one of the lucky ones who doesn't actually get the cancer that's associated with that. So you want to protect your epithelial tissues from known mutagens and carcinogens. And UV radiation is a huge one, huge known mutagen and carcinogen. And do not believe the tanning places that tell you that it does not cause cancer like the sun does. It causes all 3 types of skin cancer in only slightly less proportions, but it does not make you slightly less dead or slightly less ugly. So those are endocrine glands. Okay, so now we're going to move on to connective tissue. Okay, so connective tissue I think is the hardest one just because it really is hard to organize it all in your head, but we'll do it today. Okay, so Connective tissue is the most common tissue in the body. It's also the most diverse tissue in the body. So it doesn't look like, it's not like you can look at it and go, oh, that's a connective tissue, like you can with epithelial tissue, because like you got bone, you got blood, you got fat, they're all connective tissues. It is really widespread, with the exception of the fact that unless you're having a really bad day, it's not exposed to the outside of the body. Like if a bone is poking through, that's not a good day. So it should never be exposed to the outside of the body in a healthy person, okay? It is usually pretty vascular compared to epithelial tissue. There are exceptions, but it's usually pretty vascular. And then one of the major characteristics of connective tissue is that it has a lot of space between the cells. So for instance, here's a connective tissue. Cell, a lot of stuff between it until you get to the next cell, right? All of that crap has to be named, right? So there's lots of room for matrix in connective tissue, and then you have to figure out what's in the matrix to figure out what the connective tissue is going to be like. Okay, so now, why are such diverse tissues as blood and bone and fat all considered connective tissue? It's really because of where they come from. So we're going to organize this as we go through today. All of your connective tissues come from a common embryonic connective tissue that's called mesenchyme. Also, there's a little bit of it called mucous connective tissue, but let's stick with mesenchyme. This is during the first stage of differentiation, when you start to just differentiate into, like from zygote, you go through several hundred stages of cell division. And then you've done no differentiation at first, and you'll go, oh, this cell line is going to become connective tissues. Those are going to be mesenchyme cells, right? And then you've got another line that's going to become nervous tissue, and another line that's going to become cardiac muscle or something like that. So mesenchyme is an embryonic connective tissue that can make any other connective tissue. So it's basically a connective tissue stem cell, right? It can't make everything. It can't make brain cells, but it can make any kind of connective tissue. So mesenchyme, I'll show you a picture of mesenchyme, but I never, by the way, ask you the slide of mesenchyme because it doesn't look like a whole hell of a lot. So all you can really see from here is like, oh, it's probably a connective tissue because there's lots of room between the cells, right? And this is the other mesenchyme picture. So I don't ever ask you that histology slide. That's what it looks like. Mesenchyme will give rise to 3 different categories of connective tissue. You will have connective tissue that is almost completely fluid connective tissue, which is easy because it's just blood. You've only got one fluid connective tissue. Now I know it seems weird that blood is connective tissue, but if it's derived from mesenchyme, it is. Okay? And then you've got the ones that are mostly solid, much more solid, and these are called the supporting connective tissues, and this will include the cartilages and the bones. Does that make sense? Okay, so we've got mostly fluid, mostly solid, and then somewhere in between, the squishy ones. The squishy ones are going to be called connective tissue proper. So we will start with connective tissues proper first after we learn about connective tissues generally. Okay, and connective tissues proper will include things like ligaments and fat, that kind of stuff. Okay, all right. So before we get into specific tissues, let's just talk a little bit about functionality of connective tissues. Well, they do pretty much anything but sending electrical signals, because that's nervous, right? Making you wiggle, because that's muscles, or covering your surfaces, because that's epithelial tissue. They do like supporting you against gravity, but they also do disease fighting, because blood, so like they do all kinds of things. Like super diverse in functionality and super diverse in structure. Okay, so let's look at the basic organization of connective tissue. If you look at connective tissues, what you expect to see is cells, yeah, of course, fibers, and then not cells, not fibers, which you call ground substance. Ground substance, guys, is anything in a connective tissue that is not cells and not fibers. So what is it? Well, it depends. If it's if this were, it's not, but if this were blood, the ground substance would be mostly water. But if this were bone, the ground substance would be mostly calcium crystals. So that's why they just use the general term ground substance, because you can't really be specific unless you're talking about a specific tissue. right? But it's not cells and not fibers. That's what ground substance is, okay? So basically, the basic organization of a connective tissue is you've got cells and then you've got matrix, and then the matrix is composed of fibers and ground substance, okay? So let's look at the cells first. When you run into cells and connective tissues, you're going to run into 3 categories of cells, not all the time, but potentially. You will run into blast cells, and blast cells are like these immature cells that can either make something or make more of themselves. So for instance, in bone, you might run into an osteoblast cell that can make more bone. Does anybody know or remember from lab what the cell is called in dense regular connective tissue? Dense regular? It's called a fibroblast. What do you think it does? Makes a whole bunch of fibers. That's a really fibrous tissue, right? Okay, so a blast cell is like either immature or really important in making things that are in the tissue. Is that okay? Okay, and then of course you are going to, so here is a fibroblast right here, and maybe it made these fibers that are around it, okay? And then site cells. Site cells are more mature, less likely to be making the tissue and more likely to just be maintaining or forming the tissue. And site cells are relatively easy. What do you call pretty much all the cells that you run into in cartilage? What do you call them? Chondrocytes, right? And most of the cells that you run into in bone are osteocytes, right? Okay, so you've got blast cells and site cells. And then although you didn't run into any yet, you will in the next chapter, you also very frequently have clasped cells. And clasped cells are responsible not for building up the tissue, but for breaking it down. That sounds negative, but in order to remodel any tissue, you're going to have to do some destruction before you do some construction. Does that make sense? So if, for instance, you start working out, your bones are going to need to be remodeled to be stronger at the attachment sites for your muscles, right? And in order to do that, quite often you need to destruct and then construct. You will need to use your osteoclasts and then your osteoblasts, right? Of course, if you're working out, you're going to have way more osteoblast activity than osteoclast activity. Like the net effect is you're going to build more bone mass, but it's not like you just make a kitchen over the existing kitchen, right? You like tear out a bunch of crap. Even if the kitchen's going to end up being bigger, you have to tear out a bunch of crap before you put in other stuff. So that's what clasped cells do. Okay, go ahead.
Can clasped cells break it apart and leave the materials to be reused?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what an osteoclast cell would do is it would go and gobble up the existing bone matrix. Yeah, and bone matrix is made mostly of collagen fibers and calcium crystals. And then what it would do is it would dump the amino acids from the collagen fibers into the bloodstream, so you could reuse them. And it would dump the calcium crystals into the bloodstream so you could reuse them. So they're really recycling more than destroying. Does that make sense? That's a good question. Okay, so what else is in there? So the matrix is ground substance plus protein fibers. The ground substance, what is it? As I mentioned, you don't know what it is until you've figured out what tissue you're talking about. It's always got some water in there, some interstitial fluid or tissue fluid, greater and lesser amounts. And then it might have solids in there like calcium crystals or sugars and proteins. Like cartilage is mostly squishy but kind of strong because it's primarily made of sugars and proteins, kind of honestly like Jell-O, right? So it's like squishy, but it's got some strength to it. So the ground substance is made of any number of things. And then the fibers, basically you're going to run into 3 categories of fibers. And we'll identify these as we're going through the tissues. The 3 categories of fibers are collagen fibers, which tend to be relatively thick and unbranched, usually but not always stain bubblegum pink. Don't ever, ever, ever let color be the only thing that you use. You can use it as a secondary conformation, but never use it as the first thing, okay? And then elastic fibers here are much thinner, and they quite often will branch if you follow them enough. And then reticular fibers are right here. They're so thin that you hardly ever see them stained. They're kind of like a hairnet. So let me give you a metaphor for each one of the fibers and tell you a little bit about what they do. The collagen fibers are the most abundant protein in your entire body. They make up between 25 and 46% of the proteins in your body. They are very much like rope fibers. So if you have an individual rope fiber, it's not that strong, but if you start bundling them, they get really strong. And if you bundle them only this way, they'll be strong in that direction. But you don't have to make a rope out of it. You could also make a net out of it, right? That makes sense? So that's what collagen fibers are for. They're basically for strength. And like a rope fiber, they are not stretchy, right? They're just strong, not stretchy. So they are able to resist stress. And if you bundle them, they get even stronger. Collagen is one of the primary proteins that's involved in helping you resist gravity. So it's involved in the aging process. So with the aging process, what happens is your collagen fibers are in your connective tissues, but they're also in your bones, in your cartilage, and they're helping you resist gravity. And then as you age, what happens is the collagen fibers break down because gravity is always yanking on them, right? And then as you age, they just do not regenerate as well. So things start heading south, right? Your face starts heading south, your boobs, gentlemen, don't think we don't notice. That starts heading south too. Everything starts heading south because your collagen fibers are sort of slowly breaking down and they're not regenerating as well as they used to. One last thing about collagen fibers, and that is, if you really, really want to look like an old saddle really quickly, thank you, there are some things you could do that will age you much more quickly and break down your collagen fibers. Anybody know what they are? There's two of them. What are the things that you can do that will age the hell out of you very quickly? Any sun exposure, okay, above the very minimum. UV radiation not only is a mutagen, it also breaks down your collagen fibers and makes you age, right? Go ahead. Yeah, especially some drugs. Yeah, some drugs are worse than others.
I'm thinking smoking.
Smoking trashes your collagen fibers. I know it's not really common here in Utah, but I'm from Texas. And in Texas, a lot of people still smoke. All over the South, a lot of people still smoke. And I put myself through college by waiting tables and also bartending and cocktail waitressing. So you just saw all of the best parts of humanity. Which is where I got all the swearing. But when people come into a restaurant in Texas, the first question is smoking or non-smoking, because people still smoke in restaurants. What? Anyway, smoking or non-smoking. But I swear I don't even have to ask you. I know. I can just look at your mug and I know whether you smoke or not, right? Especially because of all of these wrinkles and the fact that it will completely age your skin. So smoking and lots of other drugs will completely age your skin. And if it's aging on the outside, it's also aging on the inside, right? So collagen is really involved in the aging process. Now, let's move to elastic fibers. Elastic fibers are these guys right here. They are thinner. They usually stain purple, dark blue, or black. And if you follow one, they may branch. Not all of them will branch, but they could branch. The metaphor that I want you to use for those is like the really thin elastics that you use on your braces, right? Individually, they're not super strong, but they are stretchy. But what if I made a bundle of them? Could I actually make some strength with a bundle of elastics? Yeah, you can get strength and stretchy, right? So you can either use them individually and then they just give you a little bit of stretch but not a lot of strength. But if you bundle them, they can get pretty darn strong. So these are your elastic fibers. And they're made of the protein elastin. They're not as strong as collagen, but they can get pretty strong. And your elastic fibers are the ones that allow your skin to do that snapback, right? So if you pinch your children, don't pinch other people's children. And don't pinch your children really hard. But if you pinch your toddler, their skin will go right back, right? Snap back. Now work at an old folks home and pinch the skin very gently of an 85-year-old person. It just stays up there. It's in no hurry to get back down, right? In addition to being dehydrated quite often, it will stay up there. So that's the elasticity in your skin. That also breaks down with sun exposure and smoking. And then the last type of fiber are the reticular fibers, and the metaphor that I want you to use for those is a hairnet. So these are not going to be particularly strong, but they're good for holding the internal or external framework of squishy things like a spleen or a liver. So how are reticular fibers made? They're actually made of collagen, but what you do is you take one of those individual collagen rope fibers and then you take it apart further. And then that's how reticular fibers are made. So they're really not very strong, but they can hold like squishy shapes, right? So what we want to do is we want to look for all of these fibers as we're going through the tissues. FYI, reticular fibers are very often present, but you can't really see them very often because they don't stain well, because they're so tiny. What's the only tissue in which you can label reticular fibers? It's reticular connective tissue. Yeah? Okay? All right. So before we get into any more detail, we're going to do we're going to do connective tissues proper first. Again, these are all derived from mesenchyme. Connective tissue propers are not super solid and not super liquid. They're kind of squishy. But the first thing you do with connective tissue proper is you do a further subdivision, and that is loose connective tissue proper and dense connective tissue proper. And this has to do with how much stuff is in the matrix. So I want you guys to look for a minute and tell me whether you tissues that I'm showing you are loose or dense. What do you think? Dense. Almost completely packed. The matrix is almost completely full. Now, how about this one? That's loose, right? Do you see that there's open spaces in the matrix? Okay, you with me? How about this one? That's dense, yeah? How about this one? Loose. How about this one? Loose. How about this one? That's dense. Okay, do you see? Okay, so you can usually figure out how to categorize them just based on like how full the matrix is. So we're gonna have 3 loose and 3 dense. Okay, we'll do the loose ones first. So, loose connective tissues, there will be 3 of them. We're gonna start with this one, which is loose areolar connective tissue, or just areolar. Areolar is a really good one to know well because there's so many questions you can ask about it. So areolar connective tissue is going to be our first. All right, so let's talk about areolar, where you're going to find it. Areolar is soft and pliable, and if you want to feel what areolar is like, pinch your skin and pull it up. The tissue that's giving, that is areolar connective tissue. And it has both strength and elasticity, so don't be surprised that it should have some snapback, but it should have some resistance as well. That's loose areolar connective tissue. You find it under almost every epithelial tissue. It's super duper common. It's like the glue of the human body. If you've ever skinned anything, you have seen it, because there is a natural division between the skin and the muscle on any organism, whether you've skinned a deer, a fish, right? Or a chicken, or a human. It's all the same. And if you put your hand or an instrument under there and pull, you can actually see it separating. Can you see the little fibers popping? Yeah, that's the fibers in this loose areolar connective tissue, okay? So like silvery fibers that you see popping when you do that. So this is loose areolar connective tissue, so let's look at it. What do you find in it? Well, it's got boatloads of cells. FYI, there are a ton of different kinds of cells in there. They call them all fibroblasts, but it's kind of a fib. Because you don't know what they are. There's all of these cells in that tissue. You can call them fibroblasts if you want. It's a little bit of a fib. I always call them interstitial cells, which means cells that are in the interstitial fluid that I don't want to identify because I might be wrong, right? So there are some fibroblasts in there for sure, but at this level of knowledge, I don't know how you could tell which ones are which. So you've got fibroblast cells. You've also got some white blood cells. It tends to be pretty vascular, this tissue, that you will often, but not always, find like a blood vessel running through it. And then let's identify some things. So of course, these are the cells. Let's pretend they're all fibroblasts, right? And then you've got different kinds of fibers. What is this fiber, guys? That's an elastic fiber, okay. What is this fiber? Collagen fiber, right? And what is this area right here? Ground substance, exactly. So this tissue is really, really easy to ask test and quiz questions about because it's got so much stuff in there. In addition, by the way, reticular fibers are in there, but you can't see them. But conceptually, you need to know that they're actually in there, okay? So this is the glue of the human body. You find it so many places. When you run into it in different body systems, sometimes people decide to rename it. Don't worry about that for right now. I'll tell you again when we run into lamina propria. I'll just say some yahoo decided not to call it loose areolar connective tissue, and that's what it is, right? But you should read about this one and be confident with it in your test. It has characteristics that are shared by most other connective tissues. So what other questions could I ask about this? I could also ask you, is this loose or dense? And which category of connective tissue is it? Proper, right? So there's like 7 questions that are super easy to come up with off of this tissue. So make sure you're confident with it, okay? And by the way, it doesn't always stain like bright pink like that. Sometimes it stains different colors, but it still has all the same characteristics. So this is areolar too, right? We've got thick fibers going down. We've got thin fibers. We've got lots of space between them. So that's areolar as well. Okay, so go ahead. Oh yeah, yeah, it's still loose. It's still got lots of space, lots of white space in there. Yeah, all of the areolars are loose. Everybody good? Okay, so go ahead. Did somebody have a question? No? Okay. All right, so now let's talk about adipose. Adipose looks really weird compared to the other loose connective tissues, but I can explain to you why it looks like that. So here's what adipose looks like. But I want you to remember that we started out here. Okay, so this is areolar. This is just a stylized drawing of areolar. But now I want you to imagine that this is areolar that's in the subcutaneous layer, right? Okay, and then this person starts getting fat. What's going to happen as you start getting fat is you will have all of this still, only you will start cell division with your adipocytes, right? And if you keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it, they are going to fill up most of the space. So here's how you start. You got some fibers, right? You got some stuff. You got some cells, okay? You had a couple of adipose cells over here, some adipocytes. And then you decided that an all-carb diet is for you. Because, of course, it's also the most pleasant diet. But if you are over the age of 16, you're going to get fat. Do you remember how you used to be able to eat when you were young and you didn't appreciate it? Like, oh my God, I could eat anything. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to motivate some cell division with these cells, right? And what's going to happen is everything else that was in there will get smashed between these big bulbous adipose cells. Do you still have collagen fibers and elastic fibers and fibroblasts in there? You do. It's just that the whole damn thing is practically full. So what does it end up looking like? Well, there's like the blood vessels and the other cells are just like smashed between there. And then if you look at it from a little further away, it just looks like chicken wire. So go ahead.
Is that how you get cellulite?
Yeah, you get cellulite in part because of this, but also because of one other thing. So hold on to that question for just a second. I'm going to get it. Okay, so all of the fibers that you had are just pressed between here. It's still very fibrous. It still has all of that. It's just that it's got so many of these that you hardly see anything. So why does it stain almost all white? Well, because mostly what you're seeing is these cells are filled with a big old vacuole called a lipid vacuole. And I'm using a water-soluble stain. So is the lipid vacuole going to stain? No. So what it's going to look like is like chicken wire, right? Like it's all like empty with little edges. Does that make sense? Okay, so I've got this lipid vacuole, and if I look at an individual one of these cells, what are these cells called? Adipocytes. So if I look at an individual adipocyte, what will happen is the nucleus usually gets pushed up against the side because the lipid vacuole is so full, right? All the cytoplasm is pushed out here too, and all of the organelles. It forms what they call a signet ring shape, which is like, you know, a class ring from the side in which like it's just really thin and it's got one little lump on the side. So this is an adipocyte with a signet ring shape. Okay. The other thing about adipose is that when it goes through cell divisions, it doesn't lay down in a single layer. It's all the same depth. It lays down in globules, like little chunky blobs. And then, if your skin follows it, then you get cellulite. Yeah? Right.
Does excess adipocytes weaken the fibers?
No, not particularly. You can make more fibers in the adipose tissue. Okay, so why do you get cellulite? Well, you're more likely to get it when you're heavy, but you don't have to be. Skinny people have cellulite too. It has more to do with how your lobules lay down, and then how thin your skin is, right? And then also, if you're not hairy, it's easier to see. So you can just grow out all the hair on your legs and then nobody can see. Right? You could. A couple other things about this. This is kind of interesting because this is actually an evolutionary survival mechanism. For 200,000 years, human evolution, until about the last 350 years or so, we had to deal with the fact that food wasn't readily available during all seasons, right? Especially in all areas of the world, it was not readily available. So it was an evolutionarily stable strategy, too. Whenever you had a lot of food, you would eat it, and then you would store it for whenever you couldn't find it next, right? So evolutionarily speaking, historically speaking, was a slow metabolism or a fast metabolism a better survival tool? Slow metabolism. Now, we are in a different environmental situation, but we have not had time for our genetics to dramatically change. So now what we have, especially in this particular society, is abundant food resources, low activity levels, and very slow metabolisms, right? And that is what you are going to have to deal with, right? Unless you can fast forward for about 50,000 years to deal with. So what happens is whenever we take in more energy than we're actually putting out, in addition to storing it as glycogen and other stuff, we will of course store it up for the long hard winter that now never really comes, right? Because we can always motivate our adipocytes to go through cell division, right? Anytime you take in more nutrients than you burn, you will motivate your adipocytes to make more storage vessels for you. Like they're going to make more cells, right? And then if you go, okay, I'm going on the Atkins diet, what you will do is you will empty out the lipid vacuoles and burn them. You guys with me? Okay? You never get rid of the cells. Okay? So, here's the deal. Every adipocyte, unless you have liposuction, that you ever had is probably still around. And if you ever let yourself get fat, right? If you ever let yourself get fat, they just stay around. And then it's easier to get fat the second time. Of course it is, yeah. Because you don't have to make the cells, you just have to fill up the cells that are already there. It's like you already rented the storage, right? You're like, you just have to put some stuff in it, right? Which encourages you to have more stuff, right? You're like, I got a storage place already, so you just make it. So you can always make more, but you don't get rid of them. And this always talks to me as a parent, because as an adult, I'm responsible for my own damn decisions, right? But if you let your kids get fat, you are giving them a lifelong battle against fat. And I'm not talking about little chubbies, little like toddlers. They're supposed to be chubs. You know when your kids are getting fat, don't you? You're like, oh heavens, what the heck is going on there? You got some blah, blah, blah. So you're giving them a problem, and it may be kind of cute, but it's not that cute when you're 30, is it? You know, it's not super cute when you're 30. So you have to like try to like. I torture my children like. I'm like, oh, well, instead of chips in your lunch, you're getting sliced vegetables. And they're like, He hates you. Like, all the other kids have chips. I'm not telling you to give them a complex about being heavy. I'm just like, keep it in mind. Okay, so there is a chemical, by the way, called leptin, which is kind of an interesting hormone that they only discovered recently. Leptin is your hormone of satiation that is released from your digestive tract and also from your fat tissue and communicates to your brain to tell you when you're full. Some of us are really, really sensitive to leptin. So you eat a little, the leptin is released, and then you're like, I'm full. Some of us are not very sensitive to leptin. Yes? Some of us don't release very much leptin. But which situation are you more likely to get the benefit of your leptin telling you that you're satiated? If you eat really, really quickly or slowly?
Slowly.
Yeah, if you eat slowly, you tend to eat less. And that is in part because the leptin has kind of feedback to your brain and tell you that you're full, which is exactly what you don't want to do during Thanksgiving, right? Because if there are mashed potatoes, the sinful ones, right, that have like cream cheese and butter and all that crap, you're like, and then afterwards you're like, oh my God, what did I do? Go ahead.
Don't they usually say that like it takes about like 20 minutes to take a back on? That's why like after 20 minutes.
It's very variable between people. But yes, 20 minutes is usually long enough for most people. But you have that friend that can eat like 5 bites and it's like, oh, I'm stuffed. And I'm like, oh, that must be really cost effective for you. I have a friend like that who she drinks like a damn fish, so I know she spends all her money anyway. I'm like, you just had 6 cocktails and 3 fries. She's like, priorities, man. But I drive her home quite often, that's all I'm saying. Okay, so now reticular is the last of the, okay, so adipose. By the way, liposuction is the only way that you can really get rid of your adipocytes after they're formed. But liposuction, do you guys have any friends who've done liposuction? Okay, so liposuction is really weird because what it does is you don't do like liposuction all over the body and pull out the layer everywhere. They do it locally, right? So my best friend is got these big old saddlebags right here. She hated them always. So she had liposuction done on these. But then the next time she started gaining weight, she didn't have her storage vesicles already here. So she just gained top butt fat, right? Really quickly. And she's like, oh my God, it was so much better to have a bottom butt. So it just changes your distribution. And if you gain weight, you'll just gain weight differently in the future. It's a really expensive lesson for her to learn. And she's like, I really want my bottom booty back. I'm like, I tried to tell you. Go ahead.
She can't produce more.
Oh, she will. But where will it go first? It's going to go first here. And then eventually she's going to make it here. And now she's going to have butt from here to here. You know, like a mile of butt. Which will be really good for jokes. Not good for her self-esteem. Okay, and then the last one is reticular. Reticular connective tissue. And reticular connective tissue is like that hairnet tissue, but it's the only tissue in which you can see the reticular fibers. The fibers you're seeing are reticular fibers. It's obviously loose, right? Okay. No need to worry about the kinds of cells that are present there. We don't usually hold you responsible for them. You probably don't know that the spleen is super active in immunity, so it's most likely to be white blood cells there. But this tissue would form the internal, like, scaffolding of a squishy organ, like the spleen. So how does the spleen hold together as a shape? It's got these internal reticular fibers, and then it's got the spleen cells between them. Does that make sense? It's like this really soft internal framework called the stroma for soft organs like the liver and the spleen. That's what you use this for. Okay, now we are ready to go to the dense tissues. The dense tissues, there are 3 of these as well. Okay, so the dense or fibrous connective tissues. Typically speaking, dense tissue is less vascular than loose tissue. There's less room for vessels. And so healing and regeneration is going to be slower in dense tissues than it is in loose tissues. Okay, so this one is called dense for obvious reasons. Why is it called regular? Dense, regular. Because the fibers are all parallel to one another. It's nice and organized, right? So dense, regular. All of those fibers are collagen fibers. So this is going to be a really strong tissue. But it's only going to be really strong in which directions? Yeah, I have to pull on it this way. If I pull on it this way, I'm screwed, right? Okay, so you have to pull on it this way. So this is dense, regular connective tissue. You use this tissue when you need a really strong, not stretchy rope to hold on to things, right, from one direction, 2 directions. And this is what the tissue that forms ligaments and tendons. Do you know the difference between a ligament and a tendon? What is it?
One connects muscle, one connects muscle.
Bone to bone. Bone to bone is a ligament, and muscle to bone is a tendon. They're made of the same tissue, and we don't want that tissue to be stretchy. I know it seems counterintuitive that you don't want it to be stretchy, but I want you to imagine for a second. Okay, so I'm going to use my biceps brachii and my brachialis with a tendon attached to the bones of my forearm, right, to pick up this water bottle, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to contract the muscle, and then it's going to pull. If this was stretchy, you would contract the muscle, have a lag time because of the stretch, and then you would hit yourself in the face with it. So we do not want ligaments and tendons to be rubber bands. We want them to be ropes. However, that of course means that they're not going to have much give if you hit them from a direction that they didn't expect. So you can tear them, right? And they don't heal super well compared to other tissues, right? So that's your ligaments and tendons, dense regular connective tissue. Now, if I needed a net instead of a rope, I could use dense irregular connective tissue. So with dense irregular connective tissue, what I have is bundles of collagen fibers going a bunch of different directions. In both of those tissues, the cells are fibroblasts. By the way, if you can't figure out what to call a cell in a connective tissue, guess fibroblasts. Because like everything has fibers, so it's safer than most things, right? So fibroblasts and the bundles of collagen going a bunch of different directions means that you can pull from a bunch of different directions on that tissue. So where would I use that? I would use that outside of a bone, the covering outside of a bone, because how many different directions am I going to yank on the femur? Well, I got muscles going this way and that way, and I can yank on it from a bunch of different directions. So it's called the periosteum outside the bone, the perichondrium outside of cartilage, and then the dermis of your skin. So if you do this, you can see that it doesn't have a lot of give, right? Okay, that's the dermis of your skin is made primarily of dense, irregular connective tissue, and it's really strong in a bunch of different directions. I know it's kind of gross to think about, but you will have a lot of experience with the dermis of other mammals because you use the dermis of other mammals to make leather. Strong in a bunch of different directions, yeah? As long as you keep it nice and moist during the curing process, then it can be used in a bunch of different directions. It's pretty damn strong, right? So that's what the dermis is. We use it from all different mammals. We can even use it from some kind of reptiles. And of course you know that some weirdo has made leather out of humans before. You know it, because we hate each other. Everything weird that could possibly have been done to humans has been done. It's been done for ethically dodgy or completely reprehensible reasons. It's also been done for religious reasons. Do you guys ever seen the relics of the saints in like Catholic churches? You ever seen this? Travel all over Europe, you can go to Catholic churches and you can see like Saint whoever's finger bone, Saint somebody's eyelashes, Saint whatever's spleen, all kinds of things in like jeweled cases. But then at some point somebody figured out that if you had a holy book, you could make it super duper holy by making the cover out of a saint. Extra super duper holy books. Yeah, you can see them all over Europe. And you're like, religion, kind of weird. Pretty much all of it. Okay. So that's dense, irregular connective tissue. And then the last one is elastic dense. Okay, elastic dense connective tissue is this guy right here. It just looks like a freaking mess. However, it does look dense, and you can probably guess that it's elastic fibers because they're so dark, right? And they're all sort of running parallel to one another. This would be really strong in this direction, right? But it'd also be stretchy. And they labeled one arbitrary little dark blob a fibroblast nucleus. There's no way in Cal you could tell that was a fibroblast. The whole thing looks like that, so I would not do that to you. It does have fibroblasts in it. So what is this used for? This is used for a situation in which you need strength and stretchiness from one direction. Your vocal cords are made of this. Okay. What?
Like the abdomen.
No. A couple other places. Between your vertebra, instead of just using dense regular connective tissue for your ligaments, you need stretch and strength, so you use elastic dense. Does that make sense? There's one weird place that they show in the textbook, which I don't know why they show it, because it doesn't really tell you anything. You've got a little bit of this right between these two vessels, but that doesn't matter. How about the elastic ligaments of the penis that pull them up during an erection, but still have some give? So you can do acrobatics, right? Those are elastic. Those are elastic. Now you'll never forget, will you? So now those are elastic dense. Yeah? That makes sense? Okay. So that's all of the propers. Everybody good? Questions over propers? Okay. Now we'll start the supportings. The supporting connective tissues include the bones and the cartilages. So in this set of notes, for some reason, you learn 3 cartilages and only 1 bone. There's actually 2 kinds of bone. You'll learn the other one in the next set of notes. So supporting connective tissues, cartilage, and bone. There are 3 cartilages that you're learning. Okay, so let's learn a little bit about cartilage in general before we actually go into the specifics. You guys know that the prefix chondro means cartilage, so whenever you run into that, it's going to imply to you that's cartilage. So cartilage, now we're getting more solid, less likely to be squishy. When I think about cartilage matrix, I think about, have you ever left Jell-O uncovered in the fridge for so long that it gets kind of stringy?
Yes.
Or gotten a piece of cartilage in your mouth and it ain't going anywhere, right? You're just like, you're still chewing on it like 25 minutes later, right? So cartilage has flexibility but a lot of strength, right? More flexibility than bone, but still a lot of strength. It is also very poorly vascularized. It has almost no blood flow that's going through the middle of it. So it's going to be really, really, really bad at healing. Okay, so you do not want to damage cartilage if you have a choice. So it's tough, but it's more flexible than bone. And one of the characteristics of cartilage, which you should be able to recognize in all of the cartilages, is that since you've got a semi-solid matrix, the cells need a place to sit. So here's what cartilage is kind of like. So you got a slide with cartilage, any kind of cartilage. What you will see is you're going to have a cell inside, usually a bright white frame. Okay, the cell is going to be called what? Chondrocyte. And the place that it's sitting is called what? Lacuna. Plural is lacunae. Lacuna means little lake. So what you're going to have in cartilage is a bunch of these with matrix between them. There's always fibers in the matrix. They don't always stain, but if you want a tissue to be strong, you better put some collagen and maybe elastic fibers in there. So even if it doesn't stain, it definitely has collagen or elastic in it, okay? So let's look at that and see if you can, just with that, tell when you see a cartilage. So this is obviously a cartilage. It's the one from your textbook. But then so is this one, because do you see sort of the frames around the cells? Not every single one of them, because you didn't get them all sliced perfectly. Now this one is 2, but this frame just happened to have gotten a little blue dye in it. But still, you've got a nice frame around. And then let's look at a couple more. How about this one? Can you tell that this part is cartilage? This part isn't, but this part is cartilage. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's see if I have any more cartilage on here. I don't remember. No. Okay, so I'll show you some more cartilage next time. So regardless of which cartilage it is, you are going to have basically sort of a frame around each of the cells. And the metaphor that you can use for this is if cartilage is like Jell-O. Imagine that you put grapes in the Jell-O before it's solidified, right? And then each grape will actually have a little place where it sits, right? And you can pull it out, right? That's the lacuna, right? So, and then the grape is the cell, right? So it has a little space that exists. That's not how it forms. Actually, the cells were there first, and they just made the matrix around themselves, and they left themselves a little place to sit. Is that okay? Okay. So that's how cartilage works. So let's look at the types of cartilage. One more thing about cartilage, and that is cartilage has a terrible, terrible blood supply, and it's not microscopically thin, right? For instance, this is cartilage, okay, right here. So that means that if you damage cartilage, you are unlikely to get it to completely heal. The only blood supply comes from the tissue that's on the outsides of the cartilage, which is dense irregular connective tissue. I know it doesn't look like it in this picture, but it's dense irregular connective tissue. And so really, if you have any cartilage healing, it's usually just at the edges, and the rest of it just doesn't heal. Has any of you guys damaged cartilage before? Yeah? Is it still damaged? Yeah, pretty much. How about anybody pierced this part of their ear before? Is the hole still there? Feel it. You know, it's still there. Even if it isn't on the skin, it's still under there. I fell on a coffee table. I got a big old chunk out of the cartilage right here in my ear. So yeah, the holes will never, ever, ever. I mean, the outside of the hole will close up, but the inside won't. Okay? So let's talk about the types of cartilage. The first type of cartilage is called hyaline cartilage. And hyaline means glassy. And hyaline cartilage is the one where you don't see fibers in the matrix. They're there, but they don't stain. So the matrix looks kind of smooth and glassy. So this is hyaline cartilage. This is hyaline cartilage. Contrast that to these two, where you can obviously see the fibers. This is not hyaline cartilage, and this is not either. Does that make sense? Okay, so hyaline cartilage, there are collagen fibers in the matrix, but you can't see them, so don't worry about labeling them. And this is the most common cartilage in your body. It forms these costal cartilages that connect your ribs to your sternum, right? This is it too, right here. If you run your fingers down your nose, you can feel where the bone ends and the cartilage starts. This is hyaline cartilage, okay? It also is between most of your bones, padding your bones in your joints, right? And most of your fetal skeleton before you actually had bone was made of hyaline cartilage. Does that make sense? Okay, now hyaline cartilage does not heal well, and that is sometimes terrible when you damage it in your knee, and sometimes good when you get a nose job. Because you don't want it to heal back to its original shape, right? Okay, so if you get a nose job, what they generally do, several different ways to do it, is they are going to shave down or reshape the cartilage, the end of your nose, and they're really going to depend on the fact that it doesn't heal, right? Otherwise, it would have been a waste of $3,000, right? And then after you let the swelling go down, your nose will hopefully be a slightly different shape. What if they screwed it up? Whoops! You know you have friends with bad nose jobs, do you? Do you? My husband's ex-wife has had 3 nose jobs. It serves her right, that's all I have to say. Her nose is like so far up right now that like I think she will drown when it rains. So far up. That was just cosmic justice is all I'm saying. So that's also what happened to Michael Jackson. I know he said he just had 1 surgery for a deviated septum, but we were not born yesterday, right? So he kept whittling down the cartilage on his nose until there was almost nothing left to hold it up, right? So be super duper duper careful about nose jobs, and maybe just see if you can live with the one that you got. Learn some makeup techniques, because they don't turn out very well very often, right? I mean, maybe you'll find the one doctor. Okay, so that is hyaline cartilage. Now let's do elastic cartilage. Elastic cartilage is a little bit more bendy, okay? Elastic cartilage has a whole bunch of elastic fibers in the matrix, and it's usually pretty easy to see, A, that it's cartilage, and B, that it's probably elastic, right? A whole bunch of elastic fibers in the matrix. It has a lot of the same characteristics of hyaline cartilage, only it's way more scroingy. So this is hyaline, yes? This is elastic. Swing, swing, swing. Not this part, but this part. That's elastic cartilage. You can feel how floppy it is compared to this one. Okay, so this is elastic cartilage. You have it not a ton of places in your body, but a few places in your body. It's got mostly elastic fibers. It's got chondrocytes and lacuna. It is found in your epiglottis. Do you know what your epiglottis is? That little flap that keeps you from literally inhaling your food, right? It's also found in your external ear, also called your pinna. It is found in your eustachian tubes, the auditory tubes. It's like forming the solid part of your eustachian tubes. Not super common tissue. And then fibrocartilage is the last cartilage. Fibrocartilage has bundles of collagen fibers. So it's the strongest of the cartilages. And fibrocartilage usually, but not always, usually stains this blue color. But don't use that as your exclusive thing, because what you really want to look at is the fact that you can tell it's cartilage because it's got frames around the cells. And then with fibrocartilage, all the fibers are parallel. They were not with elastic cartilage, and you couldn't see them at all with high heat, right? So all the fibers are parallel. This is a really, really strong cartilage, and you will find it in areas that you've got a lot of stress, especially between bones. So like the pubic symphysis right here, where two pubic bones come together, gets a lot of stress in bipedal organisms because most of the pressure is going right there. So that is fibrocartilage. You've got fibrocartilage between your jaw and your skull right here, right? Okay. You've also got two extra pads of fibrocartilage in your knee called the lateral and medial meniscus. So the knee gets hyaline and then some extra fibrocartilage. Does that make sense? So in places where, also the intervertebral discs of your vertebrae. So those pads, the discs, when you say you slipped a disc, it was specifically fibrocartilage that came out, right? So it's fibrocartilage between those. Does that make sense? Okay, so those are all of your cartilages. What are all the cells called in cartilage? Chondrocytes. What are all the cells surrounded by in cartilage? Lacunae. Go ahead.
I was going to ask, like, so since the fibrocartilage is stronger,
Yeah.
Does that make it like less likely to heal?
It is. It has a really terrible blood supply, so it's not very likely to heal at all. It's even slightly less likely than hyaline cartilage. Yeah. So you hear about athletes a lot of times tearing their meniscus, right? It's going to be torn pretty much for the rest of their life. Lateral or medial meniscus. If they are also tear the anterior cruciate ligament and the lateral meniscus, then your knee is gone and your career is probably gone because it's not going to heal. If you ever had a choice between two things and you don't get the choice, break a bone before you tear cartilage because the bones will totally heal. Bone's super duper vascular, pretty darn good at healing. Okay, so now we can do bone, and then we will be finished with supporting connective tissue. Okay, so with bone here, the only type of bone tissue you are going to learn in this set of notes is specifically compact bone. Okay, this is a hard slide. So I want you to make sure that you pay attention to compact bone tissue. Compact bone tissue, first off, let me orient you to why it looks the way that it looks. This is compact bone tissue. And compact bone tissue would be found on the outsides of all of your bones, but it's really thick in the shafts of your long bones. But here's what you are looking at. That picture that you're looking at is looking at a cross-section of maybe the femur. Okay, so how do you make your femur really, really strong? Well, the femur, the compact bone of the femur, is really made of a bunch of relatively parallel columns, like this. That makes sense? All of which are a bunch of collagen fibers, bone cells, and calcium crystals that are all relatively parallel. And then if you do a cross-section, what you're going to see is all of those circles that you're seeing right there. that make sense? So now what we have to do is sort of orient ourselves to what we're looking at there and describe it a little better. Why do I not have an eraser? Okay, so stick with me for a second. So I'm going to do a cross-section of a femur, right? I'm going to do a cross-section of a gross anatomical structure, okay? So this is a whole femur, okay? This is the marrow cavity or medullary cavity. You guys with me? Because I don't know if you knew, but your bones, your long bones are hollow like that. Got a medullary cavity. What I really want to look at, though, is this tissue out here, yeah? And if I looked at it really closely, I would see that this tissue is composed of a whole bunch of those circles. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to blow that up and look at it under a microscope. Got it? That little part right there. Okay? And under a microscope, what I will see is a bunch of these relatively circular structures that are all just really cross sections of columns. Yeah? Columns of bone matrix and bone cells, right? That are all running relatively parallel to give me a lot of strength in that tissue. So if I take one of them and blow it up, we will see one of these columns in cross-section is called an osteon. So let me show you a good picture of an osteon. Here's a good picture of an osteon. Just one. So let's concentrate on one of them, this one. This one thing is called an osteon. Good. Okay. And the osteon is going to be this repeating structure that you'd have a ton of them. Why is the bone called compact? Because they're right next to each other. All of the osteons are like crowded next to one another. Okay. The center of each osteon is how the solid tissue gets most of its nutrients. The center of each osteon is where all the blood vessels and nerves are, and this is called the what? Those of you guys who've done it in lab already? What's it called? Central canal. It's called the central canal. The central canal has all the blood vessels and nerves in it. So every little osteon is kind of like a tree, and it's getting its nutrients from the inside out. Right? You with me? Okay, so that's where the blood vessels and nerves go. And then what you have surrounding each central canal is like concentric rings, like a tree, right? And it goes ring, ring, good, and then more. We don't want to draw them all. Okay, so let's talk about what you're actually seeing there. What you're actually seeing there is layers of bone matrix that were formed sequentially as you grow, right? So you'll lay down one layer, and then you'll grow, and you'll lay down another layer, and you'll grow, and you'll lay down another layer. This layer right here of bone matrix, or any of them, is called a lamella. Plural is lamellae. It's Latin for layer.
That's just the outer ring that you're looking
No,
at?
it's any of the rings.
Okay.
So all of the rings are called lamellae. Okay, so before we go any further, I want to tell you what bone matrix is made of. Bone matrix is very much like the reinforced concrete. Do you guys know how to make reinforced concrete? What do you lay down first? Rebar, okay? And that gives it both strength and flexibility, so it's not really brittle, okay? The rebar here is collagen fibers. So lay down collagen fibers, and then you're making reinforced concrete. Then you lay down the concrete, right, which solidifies. The concrete in this metaphor is calcium crystals, yeah? So I've got collagen fibers and calcium crystals. So what is my bone? My bone isn't just strong and brittle, it's strong, flexible, and brittle. Yeah? So your bone actually bends quite a bit before it breaks. Does that make sense? So I've got layer after layer after layer of bone matrix. But how did the bone matrix get there? It was laid down by the cells that are at the boundary of each layer. And those cells are called osteocytes. Yes? And even if you can't see it, they have to have a place to sit in a solid tissue. They sit in a what? Lacuna. They have to sit in a lacuna. Does that make sense? So let's look at this slide for just a second, and then we've got one more thing to add to it. Ready? So central canal, that's where all the blood comes from. Okay. Then here's one layer. right? That's a lamella of matrix made of reinforced concrete, right? With collagen fibers and calcium salts, right? And then here's another one, and here's another one. So the only thing that we didn't address is how do you get the nutrients through a solid tissue all the way out to the edges? And you do that because it's got little canals that go through the solid tissue, like little bicycle spokes. And the canals actually allow for diffusion of nutrients and waste products and oxygen and carbon dioxide all the way out to this really, really active tissue. Who knows what these are called? These are called canaliculi, which means little canal. Canaliculi. Canaliculus is singular. Good? Okay. So, people get confused, last thing, between medullary cavities and central canals. You can see why, because this is a round structure and that's a round structure. How many medullary cavities will you have per femur? 1. How many central canals will you have per femur? Lots. They are microscopic structures. Does that make sense? Okay, so you're going to have a quiz next Thursday, okay? But study histology over the weekend because your quiz next Thursday will not be easy. Hi, you're Terry, right? I got your email, and we are trying to figure out what to do about it.
I just wanted to see what I can do.
I don't know yet. We're going to try to work with you, but the problem is that I don't know how to make up the lab stuff that you missed.
My instructor's taking care of the lab service, and I'm working with him on that and do everything that I can there. But yeah, for yours, I'm working on it now to try